This is Martin Nutty, and you're listening to the Irish Stew podcast. Last week on St. Patrick's Day, I walked over to the American Irish Historical Society to celebrate the day. The society is located in a beautiful Beaux-Arts mansion just across Fifth Avenue from New York City's Metropolitan Museum. Elizabeth Stack, the executive director, greeted me warmly at the door, along with all those who had just paraded up Fifth Avenue and had chosen to spend their afternoon at the society. The sounds of the grand piano beckoned visitors up the marble stairs to the salon, where a happy crowd had gathered. That afternoon, there were pipers, dancers, singers, all performing in celebration of Ireland's Day. After many years of uncertainty, visitors were glad to be back in the wonderful shared space, remarking on how quickly Elizabeth Stack had restored a sense of community to the grand old building. In a little over a year, Dr. Stack had created a well-regarded and attended program that fetes historians, authors, and artists telling the story of the Irish in America. That evening, I left 991 Fifth Avenue, confident in the knowledge that the society was in good hands. However, the next morning I woke up to read an article in the Irish Echo announcing the removal of Elizabeth Stack from her position, which is to be downgraded to a part-time engagement. Like many in the New York Irish community, I was dismayed to hear the news. Turmoil, it seems, is to be revisited on the society again. The bad news announcement from the society board cited the need for cost-saving measures, while committing to a continuity in programming. I, for one, fail to understand how a shift to a part-time executive director position is likely to make that possible. Given the society's location in one of the world's major financial centers, the board's apparent lack of a capital campaign to secure sufficient funds to support Dr. Stack's efforts is troubling to say the least. By now, the Society's board should also have funded a development officer and a librarian to catalogue and preserve the priceless archives and artifacts at 991 Fifth Avenue. A year ago, John and I sat down with Elizabeth Stack to talk about her life and her revitalization of the American Irish Historical Society. Given the latest news, we decided to reissue the episode so listeners could hear of the important work Dr. Stack is doing in rebuilding and preserving one of New York City's most important cultural centers. We hope you agree with our call for the retention of Dr. Stack. It is a moment that calls for good trouble. We'll continue to follow developments in this story, and we'll be blogging the latest updates on our website at irishstewpodcast.com/blog. We'll leave a link in the show notes. And now, Elizabeth Stack, Reprised.
Well, Martin, I think we're going to be hitting a topic near and dear to your heart in particular here today, and we're in a location near and dear to the hearts of the Irish in New York. Take it away.
Yeah, I'm kind of lucky. I live quite near to the American Irish Historical Society. It's kind of really in my backyard. We're actually recording there today, so if you actually hear some traffic sounds emanating from Fifth Avenue below us, we're looking out from a beautiful boardroom, looking out at the Metropolitan Museum just across the street on Fifth Avenue's hallowed Museum Mile, sitting in a beautiful Gilded Age mansion, which is the headquarters of the American Irish Historical Society. But our next guest is a native of Listowel, County Kerry, and we will talk exactly how she's related to the place we're sitting in. But she's educated on both sides of the Atlantic with a doctorate in history from Fordham University in New York and degrees from University College Dublin. She is well positioned to comment thoughtfully on the Irish-American immigrant experience. In 2018, she became Executive Director of the Irish-American Heritage Museum in Albany, New York, and earlier this year was appointed Executive Director of the American Irish Historical Society, where we are sitting right now. That institution has been much reported on in recent years, and we're not going to really focus too much on that reporting. You can spend your time on the internet if you want to get some background information, but we will be talking about the future of this institution. And with all that, I am delighted to welcome Dr. Elizabeth Stack to Irish Stew. Welcome.
Thank you very much for having me.
So Elizabeth, I'm going to kick this off. As I mentioned, we're sitting in this wonderful room, and I wanted to ask you about your very first experience coming through the doors here, because I think that would be long before you became Executive Director.
Yeah, that's right. I was working at the Institute of Irish Studies at Fordham while doing my doctorate, but I had been a high school English and history teacher for years before that in Ireland and the United Arab Emirates. And I needed to do some research for my dissertation, and I was lucky enough, to be allowed into the archives and given a tour of the building. And so I spent, a good few weeks in here looking at the Friends of Irish Freedom papers, the Daniel Coholand papers, and a couple of other, odd little books that were here, and got a good insight into the collection. But also, I was concentrating, my dissertation was on Irish and Germans between 1880 and 1924, as they kind of grappled with the movement to restrict immigration, which culminates in the Johnson-Reed Act of 24. So I was looking at things like World War I, the 1916 Rising, vaudeville, and areas where they clashed and also where they collaborated. And, I have to admit, as someone who had a master's in Anglo-Irish relations in UCD at home in Ireland, we really did not know the American connection to the 1916 Rising a lot. It's in the proclamation, of course, her banished children abroad and the gallant allies in Europe. But I was sort of surprised, at how long Roger Casement had spent here and how very involved Devoy still was, by that time. And so the fact that Casement leaves New York to go to Germany to get the guns was almost news to me, I'm sure, And then, as I say, I was able to pick through some of the letters. Coholand and De Valera had a very interesting relationship here, in that year when De Valera was out during the War of Independence. So, yeah, that was my introduction to the society. And then I would come and attend the talks. And as you say, it was kind of dwindling, I guess, before I moved up in 2018, and then COVID, of course, put the total kibosh on the society as an entity. But, sometimes I think these things have cycles anyway. I was reminded when we were setting ourselves back up that, Daniel Patrick Moynihan called this place a mausoleum to Irish America in the 70s. And so, you got to kind of inject new life force maybe in societies like this, I think. And sometimes maybe the community take them for granted. Maybe there's not enough outreach from the society to the community. And so, not that you have to reinvent yourself, because I'm very conscious that we have to stay close to our education mission, which, gives us our 501c3 status. And so the mission since 1897 has been that the world may know of the contributions of the Irish in America. So I'm very conscious that that is what's driving all of my plans, for the society. But I think, if anything, that cycle from 1970 through 2020 teaches us that, you can't take anything for granted on either side. We've seen similar things happen, at Quinnipiac, for instance, where maybe collections become expensive to maintain, or the demographics change in an area or in a college. And so, how do we best serve our community, and how can the community help us best, And so I think that's what I've been learning, even through my research in the archives, because the Friends of Irish Freedom split. Is it an American movement or is it an Irish movement? And when De Valera came and when Coholand and he, got into it, it was a tug of war for power kind of over the community, And it's hard to argue who won really, because in a way, Irish America loses its power because the movement fragmented into two different organizations.
Yeah, so the old classic saw about what's the first item on an Irish political agenda, and the answer is the split.
The split, yeah.
But
let me take it a little bit of a different direction, because I was interested that you worked on Irish and German immigration. And we get very, in the Irish community, Irish Americans, we get very centered on our epic immigration tale. Germans, it's not so often told, massive immigration to the U.S. They probably the largest
Absolutely,
group. I think I always remember, and I've never been able to find the fact that it came within one vote that German was going to be the second official language of the U.S. So I'm not sure that's true or not, but I always remember that. In talking about the immigration and the role the organization can play in the New York cultural life, is there part of aligning our story with all the other immigrant stories that have happened and are happening right now in New York?
Absolutely. And for a variety of reasons, to be honest. So my own research was, I had come to America actually really interested in the famine era. And one of my advisors said, that's been done, like you should put the scholarship forward. And you're exactly right. The Germans actually outnumbered the Irish a little bit at that time, my time period. But they're more fragmented because a third of the Germans are Catholic, a third are Protestant, and a third are Jewish. So there seems to be less cohesiveness in their community. Half of them are rich, half of them are poor.
Right.
There's uptown and downtown. And so I thought for my argument, how do the two biggest, we'll call them established groups of immigrants in the city, even though there had been arguably more pushback against the Irish because the Catholicism strain was huge at the time. So how do they navigate being good immigrants, ideal immigrants? How do they model that to new people coming in? And do they see themselves in the new immigrants who are coming from, now let's face it, different countries? And, I'm always struck as an immigration historian, the language that was used in the 1830s, right through the 50s, into the 1880s even, like those Thomas Nast and Opera cartoons are still being published in the 1880s about the Irish. That same language is used today against other groups. And, unfortunately, you get a lot of myths around immigration, which was why, for me, the 1924 Act was so important. People that tell you our name was changed at Ellis Island. They don't record names in Ellis Island, and so your name was changed either at the other side when you were getting on the boat, or you later on changed it because you had to join a union or you had to do something, And the same thing with, our people came in and did it the right way. There was no right way before 1892. Immigration wasn't regulated really, unless you were a lunatic or an idiot. There wasn't a whole pile of paperwork, that you could prove who you were. And so, women don't register, for example, as citizens because they can't vote anyway until, 1920. So this idea that our people did it the right way and stood patiently in line is false, And so I think, we'll call them later immigrant groups need to be aware, or earlier immigrant groups, but now they're third and fourth generation. We need to be aware that our story isn't always so cut and dried. We weren't always so welcome. And I think that certainly informs how I view immigration today. And then the other thing is, as the world changes, and certainly as New York City changes, it's not enough. And I think our political climate at the moment is so divided. You're balancing a fine line as an educator when you're being proud of telling the Irish contribution in America. It skates certain lines that we don't really want to get involved with, and I will say is harder to prove to a funding institution, that it deserves funding. And so some of the most rewarding work that I've done, whether it's in Albany or some of the stuff we're looking at here, is how the Irish interact with other groups. We intermarry with the Chinese, in the 1880s, because there are no Chinese women allowed come in. The first Chinese man recorded in the census in New York is a guy who took his wife's name, Brown, and converted to Catholicism. We intermarry with the African Americans and live with them and create tap dance together, down in 5 Points and Seneca Village, even across the street here. And so to deny those sides of the stories that, the Irish, of course we intermarried with the Germans and the Italians and everybody else. Of course, there were clashes over, access and rights and wages and labour. But I think it's very important that we don't study ourselves in a vacuum. We were never an Irish-only community in New York or in wider America.
So we're going to revisit a lot of these themes, and you've thrown out a lot already.
I know, I talk a lot.
No, that's what we like.
And I love it, and it fires me up. But I'd like just to dial things back a little bit. Back before your immigrant story, you're, as I mentioned in the introduction, from Listowel in Kerry. That's a town, as I understand of around 5,000 people. It's in the north of the county, not too far from the River Shannon, near Limerick. Tell me about Listowel and your people.
Well, Listowel is a special place. I suppose we're very lucky. We have a lot of famous writers and a deep love, I would say, of history and heritage. Our town was the last castle to fall to Queen Elizabeth not long before her death. And allegedly, an ancestor of mine, Garrod Ruistack, was hanged in the courtyard for defending the castle.
And the Elizabeth in this question we have to mention is Elizabeth I.
The first.
Elizabeth II wasn't hanging people.
No, Tudor, the Tudor Queen in the Desmond Rebellion. And so, that the castle would have been as big, for those of you who've ever visited Bunratty, it would have been that style of castle, but the British, bombed or threatened to bomb it and certainly did a lot of damage in 1601 or 2. And then the town actually used the stone to build most of the houses through our, so my parents, I grew up on William Street right next door to John B. Keane's pub. We bought that store in the 1880s, I want to say. We probably had rented it before. Of course, we had to get another store because we fell out with my great-great-grandfather fell out with his brothers and was moved out of the original store. But a lot of the houses are built with the stone that was salvaged from the castle. So like our houses and buildings are at least 200, 300 years old. We had a huge knock-on effect at the famine. We have a very large workhouse which was bombed by the Black and Tan, so only the walls still exist, and the chapel and what would have been one of the outbuildings, was saved. And there's a lot of, kind of folklore. We have a mass grave which was preserved and is a shrine, the school kids visit every year. So we know, a lot about the famine in our town. It's a storytelling town, I think. Right. And I remember my first day in high school, my first male teacher was my history teacher. And when he was taking attendance, he said, "Oh, you're a Stack. Are you anything to Margaret and Pio and Catherine?" And I said, "Yeah, they're my cousins." And he said, "That's great. The Stacks love history. You'll be fine." And I was like, "Oh, we love it. Do we? I didn't know, at 13 years of age." Yeah. And so, but my father loves it. He's a big, kind of into genealogy and tracing things. And now there's so much online, in terms of the parish records and newspapers. So yeah, I think my town is definitely the bedding, to grow up with writers like John B. Keane and Brian McMahon walking the streets and very into the next generation. We had that Writing Festival Writers Week, which is over 50 years old. So I think you grow up, and I'm sure Listowel is not the only town in Ireland, where you grow up with an appreciation for the stories, for the past, for the heritage, and for sharing them. We're not Killarney or Dingle, but we are kind of touristy, and there's always somebody that wants to, come in. We grew up like with people outside the door taking photographs of John B. Keane's pub, or even Stack, the name over the door, tracing their roots. And we generally were not related to them. Like, we have quite a small family actually. But it was interesting to me to grow up seeing Americans coming back looking for that tie, So I think that probably did engender the love of history with me.
Martin's usually the one that asks a genealogy question, but I was looking up in the fine research source known as Wikipedia in your town, and I saw that Michael J. Stack was from your town. He came over and was in the U.S. House of Representatives in the mid-1930s. Wow. Any relation?
No relation as far as I know. That's, it's so sad. We're not related to Austin Stack. There was about 4 or 5 brothers, I think, back in the 1880s. Now, the interesting thing is, actually, my great-great-granduncle was in the Irish Parliamentary Party with Parnell. So the irony of the whole thing is we have a document signed by all of the party in 1886, and his signature is on the wall here in the society. But that's the only connection I have, to Stacks in New York, which is unfortunate. So, yeah, my grandaunt moved here in the 60s, but they didn't have kids. She had 2 brothers who didn't marry, so we tend to have smaller families and less cousins. One branch of the family moved in probably the very early 30s. So my grandfather's first cousins, they would have been his generation as kids. So they were born in a stole, but moved through Canada into Michigan. And then, so we have two families of brothers who moved, as I say, my grandfather's, first cousins. And now they're in Chapel Hill, and we've got one upstate in upstate New York in Casanova. So it's good to find those. We kind of weren't in contact with them most of our lives, but nobody kind of close.
Yeah, and just following up on the notion or the appreciation, maybe is a better way to put it, of history or a sense of history in Listowel. When do you make the move from just having an appreciation to saying, this is going to be my career? Because you head off to Dublin, right? You go to UCD. I think you get a degree, if I remember, in, literature and history, I think is what you started off, and then a master's degree in Anglo-Irish relations. At that point in time, clearly you're zoning in.
Yeah.
So tell us that
story.
moment.
So, I mean, it's interesting, I was 17 going to university, almost 18, but you apply almost, the year before. So I was quite young, and I knew I wanted to do either something with history or English, maybe be a journalist, or maybe be an actress, or maybe be a psychologist. So I studied history, English, and psychology at UCD. And
I'm sure the psychology interest is still playing in your head
but
all
it
the time.
turns out it's a science degree, so there was a ton of math, which I am not, good at. And very quickly I learned that it wasn't psychology I meant rather than counselling,
Right.
To be honest, I think I was drawn to the personalities who taught me. I had fantastic professors on both sides, but the history... And I think too, because, there were often heated arguments. I remember, sitting in a table, a tutorial, they call them, with my professor, because, there's 700 people in your class and then you're divided into smaller groups. And I had Professor Ronan Fanning, Michael Laffin, Richard Aldous, who's teaching now here at Bard and has given a number of talks for us. And, there'd be 6 students and violent arguments about, De Valera or Collins or... even later on, economic policies and stuff. And I just thought, what a great way, to get you thinking and present you with new ways of looking at the world. And so, mainly it was because of my professors. I stayed on to do a master's in Anglo-Irish relations in the 20th century. And then actually I worked in marketing for 4 years because I was a little bit lost. I didn't think I wanted to be a teacher. Technically, I wasn't a trained teacher by then. I hadn't done my teacher training degree. And so I was a tiny bit, I think... lost. One of my best friends got cancer and died subsequently. We were 24. So, I certainly, but that was, a life-changing moment in one way, because I hated my job in marketing. And it made me think, God, if I was told tomorrow that you've only 2 years left to live, I would be not happy, with what I was doing. So that made me realize I did love history and English. What am I doing? And actually, it was her mother. I was out for lunch with her mother, and she said, you're trained in these subjects. Why are you working in marketing? Yeah. And she also said a life, in service is better than a life, no disrespect to the marketers, but, we all know we're going to buy sausages and rashers. I ran the in-store demonstration program for Tesco. It was a below the line, they call it marketing, a coupon for a cleaning solution. You're going to buy the clue, and so I felt that I was just making money for people who had enough money, and I was forcing housewives to buy things that they were going to be buying anyway. It wasn't very rewarding. And I went into teaching almost immediately and have stayed. And I've transitioned now, obviously, to, public education. Because I think, there's a bit of bureaucracy around teaching. I will say I think the game has changed in teaching. Standards have changed. Some for the better, of course, but not always, and it's not as fulfilling, I think, when... kids are almost afraid, I think, to be presented with something that maybe challenges them. Or, I was always told universities where you're made to be uncomfortable. I found it very freeing, to go to college in Dublin, knowing nobody, 700 people in your class. Whereas I came from, you're Damien Stack's daughter, or you're Jeremiah Mulvihill's granddaughter, or your mom is Joan. Everyone knew everything about me in my hometown. And so I thought college was an amazing place to expand your universe instead of solidifying what you had come from, and I see that not being the case anymore. And I don't mean that from really a political standpoint, or I'm not anti-woke or anything, because I think there have been strides made in that way too, but history isn't pretty.
Right.
We have killed people, we have tortured people, we have told the wrong stories, and to be presented with two different points of view and try to weigh up that, evidence and synthesize your information and then write persuasively about why you believe one over the other. I think those are incredibly important skills that every job needs, not just historians. And particularly now with the way the media has, kind of expanded into social media and disinformation and misinformation. I was talking to Terry Galway last night. We had an event here, and he said a politician 10 years ago on Constitution Day gave a speech about how amazing the Constitution was and quoted chapter and verse from the Declaration of Independence, two separate documents. Yeah. If we can't get those basics right, we're kind of in trouble,
Yeah. Just thinking about this type of discussion, I'll telegraph an episode we have coming up with Martin Nutty from the former Lord Mayor of Belfast. And, he's coming from Belfast, and he was in the belly of the beast. He went through all the experiences that people think about. And he was talking about how he had never experienced such division as he's experiencing in the U.S., which was really sobering.
Yeah. And it's shocking because that's exactly right. Like, if there aren't bombs on the streets or parades with drums, you don't think that there's division. But we had Frank Barry last night from Bloomberg, who rode his RV across the Lincoln Trail and talked to people at different perspectives. And, the book is quite optimistic, actually. And I said to him, I think it's gotten worse since January 6th hadn't happened then, all of these things. And, how are we, and, in fairness, the incumbent, and I'm not expressing my own opinion, but the incumbent looked so much more attractive, I'm talking about President Biden at the time, not an incumbent. But so there was sort of you could say a more clear 50-50 choice, whereas I think even Democrats aren't really happy now with that choice. So it's much more fragmented within the Democrat Party, within Republican voters, and, it seems almost impossible, I think, to bridge that gap because, youth seems to be divided from the elderly or even the middle-aged when you look at all of the different student protests. It's very concerning to me, that we actually are getting further and further siloed from each other, because you choose your news source. And so if it's TikTok or Fox or whatever it is, and there's since COVID too, we don't trust pharma, we don't trust government agencies, we don't trust the media. So I'm not sure how we can bring ourselves back to the center or even just back to talking with each other without, it kind of exploding out of control.
I have a couple of theories on that. And interestingly, one of our former guests, Mark Little, who has kind of made a career, in recent years in terms of addressing disinformation. His comment was, for certain people, it is enough to create a climate of absolute uncertainty about anything for them to achieve their goals.
Yeah.
So I think that's an important lens to understand, how things are operating. But I'm swinging back to history again because we are in a historical society, specifically an American one. And while we might think that we are living in extraordinarily volatile times, and I think that is a valid position to take, I'd also remind our listeners and other people that this country has lived in even more divided times. We need to talk about the Civil War because that's how bad it can get.
Yeah.
And the consequences of that, and understanding that, I think, is a big deal. And of course, the Irish were major participants in the American Civil War.
We were, and no more than the Germans. It kind of helped sanitize, our reputation or speed or our acceptance into society. So, when you talk about the divisions, when you look at, the 1830s and 1840s, convents and churches being burnt in Boston and Philadelphia, they threatened to do the same here in New York, which is why, the Ancient Order of Hibernians were founded. But Dagger John, the bishop at the time, said, if you burn one of my churches, I will make of the city a second Moscow, And so...
Tough man.
Tough men, And so to see that, 25 years later, when we have the Civil War, and Irish and German and working class Americans enroll, that's not to get into the draft rights and, the threat of the conscription, but the willing enrolled in the first year or two. And of course, it was a great job and it was well paid. And there are other motives, other than ideological, right, for fighting in a war. But that, I think, solidified the fact that this worry that there was about, Catholics not being good citizens and not being able to be small or Republican citizens, the war did a lot to rehabilitate, their issue and show that they would actually contribute to an American society.
Well, let's move over to the Hudson River and head north and get a little feeling of your time in Albany. We like to visit a lot of different parts of the world in Irish stew. And we are here in New York, but we have someone here who has experience in Albany. So let's hear a little bit about the Irish world of Albany and your organization that you headed there.
So the Irish American Heritage Museum was founded about 38 years ago. Originally, they were housed down in East Durham, the Irish Catskills, and but it was a seasonal, operation. And then probably 15 years ago, they moved up to Albany. And it had the backing of the American Irish legislators, a number of kind of union leaders. Albany and the Capital District in general is actually very densely populated with Irish Americans, many of whom, had come in obviously for the Erie Canal, but even a little bit earlier. And then some had come down through Canada, during the Great Hunger, when it was cheaper to emigrate to Canada than to New York. So we've had a steady stream, people in the 1920s, even one of the treasurer up there, his father had come from Sligo, and they had aunts here. And actually, when the guy landed in New York, the aunt said, "You're not staying here because you'll just get into trouble. You're going upriver." So Albany, Troy, huge factory town. So a lot of money in the Gilded Age up there. And of course, it's the capital city, So it was an interesting place to work because it is the capital, but it's a small city, and it seems quite rural, like 25 minutes from the Berkshires and things. Very beautiful. But COVID, really kind of did a number on it. I have to say a lot of the state workers still were not back. We have a lot of universities. It was the best of both worlds. There was theatre, there was universities, there was politicians, there was a thriving, kind of heritage partnerships that we were involved with, and of course the state archives and things. But a difficult town to get your finger on. A lot of the people live in suburbs, right. And I lived downtown, the museum was downtown. Our demographic are aging, and no more than here, to be honest. Like you find that, it's the 60s and maybe 70s plus that are most interested. Their kids my age are, on a career track, or they're bringing people to Little League and swimming and gymnastics and all kinds of things. And then the grandchildren are learning Irish dancing. But we're missing that middle generation, and if we don't get them involved, that's kind of the detriment, I think, for any organisation, and it is difficult to, their tie with Ireland is that bit further out. Maybe right. The 70-year-old remembers Nana, with her brogue and all of these stories and things. So I think both organisations here and up in Albany kind of struggle with maintaining the membership and bringing in newer, younger people.
I've spent a little time in Albany. I used to work up at Saratoga
at
the race course. John Morrissey, who ended up in Troy, one of the most interesting characters I've ever read about.
Yeah.
He founded the Saratoga race course. But one other name for Albany in Irish comes up for me is William Kennedy. Maybe the greatest Irish American writer of currently working.
Absolutely. And he was instrumental in the early days of the museum too. And actually we have had him in, to the museum a couple of times. He gave last year in November, the city and all the heritage partners and the distillery got together to try to make All Souls Day like Bloomsday. So we read the entire novel. It was, he had a trilogy, an Albany trilogy. Right, and on All Souls Day, we read the book, and it was fabulous. So it ended like on stage and in the Cap Theatre with, our mayor and our kind of some of our local legislators and himself, out. So very, he's very involved in the community. It was funny, to see somebody of his stature, and he would come to talks, or very involved still with the Writers' Institute up there. It's a lovely town. There are, huge Irish inks. Martin Glynn, we have a portrait of him here in the room that we're in, Governor, his house is still there, and there's a plaque on the wall because he didn't live in what's now the Governor's Mansion. And was instrumental, in bringing the British to the table with De Valera to try to end the War of Independence. So and again, when De Valera visited, apparently he would visit with the servants in the kitchen downstairs to talk to them because they were off the boat Irish. So it's interesting,
So Albany, and you spent quite a few years up there. How does the big shift downriver take place? Well, we obviously know that there was problems in the American Irish Historical Society. We're not going to beat that horse to death, so let's stipulate
But maybe that was something you were watching from afar.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. Yeah, I was. I mean, it was concerning to see it go, and particularly it was coinciding with the Quinnipiac thing, and I could see, as running a museum up in Albany, it is difficult. Like, outlay is huge. Trying to keep, as I say, bums on seats, and encourage them to turn out. Like, it's lovely, very easy, to sign a petition, but difficult to follow through with, becoming a member or attending events. It's very important when we're applying for grants that we can say like 100 people come every month,
Right.
And so I was watching, and then, probably people might know, I was approached by the Charities Bureau simply because I had a PhD in Irish American history, if I would be on the interim board to try to assess, the archives, what was here, what needed to be done. So I and two other people were on the interim board, and the interim board hired an interim executive director. And we worked with an organization called Sea Change Board Strong. Sea Change was the head of the interim board. Board Strong, who work with the Council of Nonprofits in New York, set up the new board. So we weren't, having anything to do with each other. We signed off on June 30th. The new board came in July last year. And then in September, they ran, technically, I guess, a nationwide search, for executive director. And I had said to the Charities Bureau when they called, I'm not necessarily board material, I'm a worker, and so this would have been my dream job, if it came up, and would I still be eligible to apply? And so they said I was, and I applied and interviewed and, was delighted to get the job. It is certainly, it's difficult, I think, as a small museum, director to progress in your career. And I loved Albany. I'd been there for 6 years. I can confidently say, like, I transformed it. We were a small storefront. We moved to a much bigger location where we had a theatre and exhibition space. And, I know I improved the income, and certainly got grants and things. The staff increased. I was the only staff for 2.5, 3 years. And so, to be able to be given another challenge, was very exciting. And as I say, it doesn't come up that often in Irish American circles, and so, and again, I haven't come from a museum background. I've come from a teaching background. So that's, I can't do what the Met does in terms of mounting exhibits, or I can't even kind of, fix our own books and things. I'm not an archivist. I'm not a restorer. So this was absolutely a dream job. As I say, when I came here in 2010 anyway, I was already excited. So then, it's a challenge. It's different from Albany because I think there's a lot more riding on it. The Albany didn't have the whiff, we'll say, of scandal. And we did have the challenges. This is an incredibly expensive building just to maintain. It's old, it's landmarked, so we can't really change anything. Like we fixed the elevator, which is, going to have to be inspected every year, and you have to pay maintenance every month, even though nobody's riding the elevator, Same with the AC, like we fixed the AC, incredibly expensive. Again, because the building is old, it's freezing on the first floor, and then there aren't vents on the reception rooms. There's like 2 vents that does the entire 100-foot long room. And so, trying to work within the limitations of the physical building is one thing, and then regaining trust from the community and just hoping to get our message out there, like that we're back, we're welcoming, we're here to stay, we hope, and to be utilized as a resource.
You mentioned earlier on injecting life forces into the organization. How do you do that in a museum that's dedicated to the past?
Yeah. Well, I think, and this was my approach in Albany too, I think you honor the past, first of all, by, displaying it and sharing it and allowing access to the archives and all those things. But I do think our lecture series is what I'm kind of most excited about. It's not really enough to just give a lecture on, the Irish and the fighting 69th or whatever it is. I do like to be able to draw those parallels between the Irish and African Americans or the Irish and Chinese. We do some stuff on modern Ireland, which I think is very important. Sometimes I think there's a little disconnect between Irish America, which sometimes is a little bit more conservative and slightly more Catholic. So every year I get calls lamenting, that they've repealed the 8th Amendment at home, or that there's same-sex marriage brought in by, popular vote. But this is modern Ireland. I certainly was raised in a church that I felt was all about social justice. Maybe I misinterpreted what they were saying, but, do unto others as you would have them to do to you, is a very, I think, encouraging and liberal and progressive value, And I will say that church was also one of the worst abusers, in the history of kind of institutions. 1 in 4 people in Ireland were physically or sexually assaulted by the church. And so we've had to grapple with that, as a congregation. And many people in Ireland have chosen, rightly or wrongly, to turn their back, on the institution. And so I think it's important that as a society, like if you're interested in hearing about Irish history, you have to talk about that, We have to talk about Brexit and Good Friday Agreement and what that means for Ireland and Europe and America going forward. I think, to not be dwelling on the past always is where some of these lectures and writers will come in, when we have these talks.
Talk to us a little bit about, I think of, when I look at New York specifically, Irish American institutions in New York. We have the Irish Arts Center, we have Luxman House, NYU, another Irish center. We have the Irish Rep. And then I think we have this place.
Yeah.
To me, they are kind of the 4 corners of a rectangle.
Yeah.
But as we know, this corner of the rectangle was crumbling. How do you work with the other 3 corners? Where do you see this institution, the distinct place for this institution, and what its needs or what it needs to represent in relation to those?
I am very conscious of that. The easy and the most immediate answer is we're collaborating with the Irish Rep again to bring the dead, for instance, back here, in November and December.
If I could just see this, it's just an unbelievable experience.
Yeah, I'm excited to see it.
It's a pricey ticket,
right?
And every bit well worth it. It's a completely immersive, beautiful experience.
Yeah, and like the setting is so perfect for it.
You're in the middle. The actors are talking to you. You sit down to the meal with all the celery and all the things that were on the table, and you move to another room, and it's really
something special. Yeah. So I'm excited. I think Kieran and Charlotte are powerhouses.
Yes.
But you're right. Like I think first of all, there's room for all of us, and we all do a slightly different thing. I love the Irish Arts Centre. I'm going there on Thursday to see Panty Bliss's show. So for instance, when they did the play Agreement, we did a 1-day symposium with Queen's University and Lyric Theatre, and they talked about how artists can kind of help to deal with trauma by telling the stories. But there was an excellent panel too on like gatekeeping stories and when is it too soon, or who gets to tell the story, who's recording the information, what does verbatim theatre look like, So there's ways I think where we can complement each other's programming without stepping on toes. Like clearly I can't compete with the Irish Arts Centre. It's a multi-million-dollar and fantastic resource for New Yorkers. But I do think that we can kind of add maybe an academic sort of side to some of their programming. NYU and us, I guess, are the most similar in one way. And so I am conscious of that going forward, that Thursday is their night for talks. Let's not schedule opposite them. Obviously, they have archives. I do think it's important that we keep our archives here rather than merging, sort of, But I absolutely would love, and have worked with them. We've had similar, the Annalisa Shrout, for instance, spoke for them and spoke for us. I've had Kevin Kenny give lectures in Albany, and he'll give one here again. So it is, I think, important that we collaborate a little bit. We collaborate with Origins Theatre Company too. I'm mad about George out in Queens,
Yes,
so there's
George Haslam.
and the Emerald Isle Centre and the Ashling. And again, those are very much welfare sort of and social immigration rights. But it's important that, actually I'm going to their cruise tomorrow night. Tonight is the Emerald Isle cruise on Wednesday. Yeah.
Celtic cruise,
exactly. So, I think there's more than enough to go around, and we fulfill different needs, in the community.
Mm. So talk to me a little bit about programming, right? Again, I think of American Irish. Why not call it the American Irish Society to make it broad-based? Or how historical does the programming have to be?
Yeah, I mean, look, this is something I suppose we're kind of grappling with a little bit. The society was founded in 1897 specifically to be, reading rooms for well-heeled gentlemen, and most of our library, dates from around that time, and later on chairmen, donating their books. I think we have to be conscious that it's not just New York history, although there is a lot. Devoy was a newspaper publisher here for many years, so we have huge, amounts of his newspaper, not all of which is digitized elsewhere. We have, as I say, the Freedom, Friends of Irish Freedom papers, and Daniel Coholand, who was a judge, as well as other things here. Burke Corcoran, we have some of his papers. So I do think we should stay true to historical, but I think at the same time, the definition of a historical society is wide enough that you can encompass, literature. And as I say, modern Ireland, like we're still sort of seeing what's more, like we had 50 people for Christine Keneally's talk about the famine last week. I do think sometimes our base are more interested in hearing about Irish history than they are Irish American history. And, that's something we're kind of seeing our way through. But I would love to do, for instance, like a text and context series and talk about the lives of Irish women in the 20th century as you look at, poets like Evan Boland, or plays by John B. Keane, or there's a fabulous play called Eclipsed about the mother and baby homes. Like, this is something that is still resonating both in Ireland and Irish America. I met a guy the other day who was given up for adoption and adopted out to America, and now with Ancestry and the DNA tests and stuff, this is becoming more and more and more a thing where people are looking for their roots. And so I think we absolutely have a role to fulfill there, where you could talk about, all of these reports that they've done in Ireland. They're still arguing for compensation for victims of the Magdalene system, we'll call it. So I think all of that is under our remit, as well as then, the Irish in Butte, Montana, or the Irish in San Francisco in the gold rush, I hope to cover it all, to be honest.
Yeah, because it is not the New York Irish Historical Society, it is the American Irish.
And I think they were very conscious about choosing to call it American Irish and not Irish American, and so they're like Teddy Roosevelt. I'm looking at his bust, staring down at us. Teddy Roosevelt gives speeches in the early 20th century absolutely lambasting hyphenated Americans. You cannot be an American if you're hyphenated. And yet he was a proud member of the American Irish Historical Society, and we know from like Coholand and De Valera's fight later that was kind of the central argument. Does De Valera get to dictate to Irish America policy, or should it be run by American Irish who understand the American political system, better? And so I think they deliberately chose American Irish to say they were proud Americans first, of Irish extraction second, We
were talking about the relationship of this organization to the gems of Irish culture and heritage here in New York. How about the other, as part of New York City? I was thinking, do you have your eyes on the New York Historical Society at all? Because they went through a very, it's on a different scale, but they went through a similar arc where, I can't remember, a decade ago, it looks like they were gone. They're in my neighborhood, so I'm familiar with it. And they kind of clawed their way back, and they figured out new ways of presenting information and bringing in new people.
So that's exactly right. I mean, I had lunch with some of the staff over there. I mean, they have transformed. I did research over there too in about 2010, and it was a construction site, oh my God, when I think back. And now to see it, the shop and a cafe and a restaurant. And, so, we need a donor. Like if you have Gilder Lerman or whoever it is, that's pretty significant. But yeah, they seem to be very cooperative. I would like to do same thing, not necessarily cross programming or programming against them, but complementary programming. Yeah. So Harold Holzer spoke there. He also spoke here about Abraham Lincoln and immigration. I love what the Lower East Side Tenement Museum does. And I knew Annie Polland down there. I believe the Irish tour has changed a little bit. That was kind of happening when I was up in Albany. And so, there had been a little bit of outcry about that. But the recreation of the stories, I think, is such an important, and like they are another example of someone who, their original mission was we tell the stories of this building,
Right.
and now they're actually expanding to tell the story of the whole neighborhood. And so, there's Puerto Ricans and later immigrants that did not live in the tenement on, oh God, is it Cherry Street, Orchard Street? Orchard Street. And so, I think that will allow us to kind of expand a little bit too. I'm hoping to meet the Ukrainian Institute down the street, although they don't, I think, do as much programming.
Right.
They have some exhibits and things, but it's mostly, it seems to be kind of a rental, space. But yeah, I think that's really important. The Museum of the City of New York, I would like to collaborate with. The Met, we used to have a good relationship with the Met. I got to get back in there. I met the librarian, so that was good. But we'll have to, start building bridges there. And yeah, I think, as Martin said, we're not a New York or the New York Institute, but that's a very convenient way, of gaining access. Like I would love if our Upper East Side residents, there was nothing stopping them coming to the talk last night. It was, Frank Barry's book about traveling across America. You don't have to be Irish at all to come to it. Most of our talks are free and open to the public. So I do want the residents of this district to be aware that we're here and feel welcome to come in and, possibly join, So yeah, I think there's a diversity which is inclusive in a good way without losing sight of our mission.
So earlier you referred to the fact of the petition that was circulated when it was proposed a few years back by the previous board to sell this building, which caused an enormous outcry, well reported in the news.
I signed that petition
and so did
as the
I.
president of the IBO.
In Irish America, and some 40,000 signatures were given to that petition. This is an expensive building to run. We'll talk about the building in just a moment, but I want to talk about the needs of this institution. And I think you mentioned beforehand, the electric bill is $16,000 a month.
It can, get up there between water, steam, and electricity. It's, very, very expensive. And we weren't even running the AC, so I dread next month. But yeah, like I can tell you, we don't have 40,000 members, and so I would love if the people who signed the petition, would look at our website, which we had to rebuild. We lost access to the old one. It's AIHSNY.org. There's a membership form there. There's a donate form there. There's a volunteer form. Just get involved. If and again, it's that lip service thing. Oh, we saved the building, but it's not enough to save a building. Like we have to maintain it. We have to keep, putting money into it. Like the stone at the back had to be replaced. We had to do roof repairs. It isn't a monolith that's preserved in amber. Like it's a living building. And so there are costs associated with that. And not to be, facetious about it or to be money grabbing, but we can't do our jobs if we don't have access. And so, or if we are not supported, we just cannot sustain it on goodwill alone, and so while I adore working here, I have to pay the bills, and so I do hope that the people who were fired up enough to prevent the sale and sign a petition and, go online and take that time, I do hope they, really back up their good wishes with action and support us.
You correct me if I'm wrong, but my sense is that in a nonprofit like this, small money leads to big money.
Absolutely.
Because you need to have a membership base. You need to have a donor base because that's what the foundations are looking at.
Yeah.
Are you supported by the community? So those baseline memberships contribute modestly, but they also position you for much more serious funding.
Yeah, that's exactly, if we say that 42 people have signed up to be a member online, that's not going to win me any prizes,
Right.
And so we need, I'm amazed that there was 40,000 signers of a petition and not even a percentage practically, have become members.
Yeah.
And again, maybe they don't know. It took us time to build the website. That wasn't active until late March. But we're very active on Facebook every day. We write these little history essays. You'll get a newsletter. We're working at what the benefits of becoming a member are other than saving the building to maintain it. But yeah, that's exactly right. You know, if we aren't seen to be serving some community, then, you know, we won't get the grants from the city or the state or the federal government.
The foundations.
Foundations. Yeah. You know, you have to have a solid base, as you say, even if that's not hugely. I mean, in Albany, we had over 600 paying members, and then, you know, 2,500 people signed up to get the newsletter. But that 600 was, in the early days, it was at least a third of the budget. You know, I was the only employee. So to be getting $45,000, you know, in membership fees was excellent for that small little museum, you know, and if we had a comparable figure here, it would be amazing.
So I know I did say we were going to talk about the building, but the truth of the matter is, unfortunately, we're short of time. So I think we're going to invite ourselves back to have a second conversation at some point in time. Because I think it's a fascinating piece.
Just one note I have about the building. It's a beautiful place. It stands out as you walk down many beautiful places on Fifth Avenue. But I would always go by here, you know, before I really got involved with Irish things so much in New York, saying, how the heck did the Irish ever get this place? Yeah. It's a jewel.
It is. And, you know, that's like the sad thing, I suppose, about all that. When they bought it in 1939, they bought it with money donated by the Palace Association, the Irish Palace Building Association, which had been in existence since the 1880s, you know, and had been looking for a place and never found one. And so this kind of defunct organization, you know, donated the last of the money to buy the mansion. And, you know, that legacy, like that money, the Irish Palace Building was all immigrant maids, you know, donating $1, guys in construction. It wasn't, you know, huge millionaires donating big money. It was the community coming together. And I wrote about it in my dissertation, but Tyler Anbinder has recently written about that Irish Palace Building Association. And, you know, they did a kind of a presentation at the World's Fair, and an old woman cried. She was able to touch soil from, I think, Roscommon. And, that was where they got their money. And that was the foundation for this mansion. So I think we get carried away sometimes like, oh, a mansion on Fifth Avenue. But it was built with, you know, the blood, sweat and tears of immigrants and their descendants. And I hope we can keep it.
And with that, I would like to say on behalf of John, myself, and our listeners, thank you.
Thank you.
To Elizabeth Stack. It's been a delight to sit down and hear just a small part of the story of the American Irish Historical Society and your emerging career here.
Yes.
Hi, it's Martin. That was the episode John and I recorded with Elizabeth Stack some 9 months ago at the American Irish Historical Society. Obviously, things have changed since our discussion. We hope you agree with us that Dr. Stack be retained at the Society, and we'll be blogging about developments as they emerge in the upcoming weeks. So please visit irishstewpodcast.com/blog to get the latest. This is Martin Nutty, and you've been listening to the Irish Stew Podcast. Irish Stew is produced by John Lee, Martin Nutty, and Bill Schultz. Editing, mixing, and mastering by Bill Schultz. Music on Irish Stew was composed and performed by Rosa Nutty, with Donald Bowens on drums, Cathal O'Riordan on bass and synthesizer. For more on Rosa Nutty's music, please visit rosanutty.com.